Hi everyone, Edward Lishner here. This is the first video in the new series that I'm starting on how to hack GraphQL APIs. Now before you do that, you first have to understand what GraphQL exactly is and why an API provider would want to use that technology. So that's the purpose for today's video. Here we go. So what is GraphQL? It's a query language. With GraphQL syntax, you can write queries that will describe exactly what you want to get back from the API. From a user's perspective, it's a pretty efficient process. You write what you want and the app gives it back. Well, at least it does so within the scope of what the API provider wants you to see. There are obviously limits. You can't just go and poke around totally unchecked. We'll go more into that in a later video. But basically, you're free to ask what you want as long as it's legit. From an API provider's perspective, GraphQL limits the amount of data going back and forth. So it's less traffic on the network, less workload with servers. It's a more efficient use of the infrastructure, so GraphQL helps improve performance. Now you're probably thinking, hey, I've been dealing with APIs and it's just not how it works. Now, the reason for that is that there are two main flavors of APIs that you will come across. Actually, there are more than that, but these are the two that you're most likely to see out there. RESTful APIs are by far the most common. I'd say well over 90% of the APIs you'll come across are RESTful APIs. In contrast, GraphQL APIs are really not as mainstream. To give you a bit of background, GraphQL was originally created at Facebook in 2012 for their internal use. I believe they used it for their mobile app. After a few years, they made the GraphQL specs open source in 2015, and companies started using it. It gradually caught on, and companies like Shopify, Netflix, PayPal, GitHub, Airbnb, they all started using GraphQL. Now, GraphQL APIs are still a minority, but it is expected that they will become more and more common. Okay, so let's look at how both technologies work. With the RESTful API, as a user, you get a list of queries that you can send to either get some data back or modify the data that is sitting on the server. Each of these queries targets a specific endpoint that will send back data in a fixed set of fields. So the process is pretty straightforward. Also, API providers want to make sure that their users can use their APIs to their full extent. So they will often provide you with all these queries in a collection that you can load into Postman. Then you can just pick the one you want in the list and hit the corresponding endpoint. You will also usually get some documentation that explains how to use these queries and what they give you back. Now here again, there are limitations. The first that comes to mind is that if you require data that happens to come back from several distinct endpoints, then you have to send several queries to get back what you want. So that's not really the best way to go, and certainly not the most efficient use of the network. Also, you may not need all the data that comes back with any given query, especially since API developers often try to limit the number of queries to use with their API so they don't end up with a nightmare collection of endpoints. So they tend to return a lot of data with a given query, expecting the client application to parse the data and keep just what it needs. The risk with that is to reveal too much info, some of which may end up being used maliciously. Okay, so let's look at an example. Here we are in Postman, and I have loaded a collection called VAPI. VAPI is a deliberately vulnerable API. It's full of bugs, and you can use it as a practice range. If you're interested, I have a full walkthrough of VAPI on my blog that you can check out. You'll find the link in the description below. So here on the left side, we have a list of folders with some queries. In API 1, right here, we have create user, get user, update user. In API 2, we have a login query and another one that brings back some details. We've selected a query called create user. Here we have the corresponding endpoint right here. It's a post request, and here we see in the request body that we need to provide some data as we create that new user. We must give a username. We need to give the user's full name. Here we have the course that the user is enrolled in, so we're probably on one sort of online training website. And we need to provide a password that the user will use to log into their account. When we send the request, we can see that the user has been created successfully, and in the response body right here, the API confirms the username, the full name, and the course, and we also get a user ID right here. So this is how a RESTful API works. Now, a GraphQL API works differently. All queries will generally go through one single endpoint, and some APIs will also provide an interface, usually on a separate endpoint, that you can use to write and send your queries directly from your browser. So you can type in a query specifying what you want, and you get a single response with the data you requested. So you're not tied to what such or such endpoint is able to bring back. Now, the benefit of that is that you don't need to send multiple queries to assemble the data that you want. And you only get what you requested, so a client app doesn't get to pass a large set of data to keep just what it needs. And obviously, it also limits the risk of excessive data exposure because the app isn't sending back large chunks of data in the response body that you didn't really ask for. So let's see an example. Here I'm using a deliberately vulnerable practice API called DVGA. This means Damn Vulnerable GraphQL Application. I've installed it locally on one of my machines. So this is why we have local IP address right here. Oh, and in case you're interested, I published a walkthrough of DVGA on my blog that walks you all the way from installing the app to solving all the challenges. I've included a link in the description below if you want to take a look. So here I'm in my browser and I'm using an interface that DVGA is making available. It's called GraphQL or Graphical, you can pronounce it the way you want. So on the left side here, you can write your queries, and on the right side, you get a response back as a JSON object. In this example, I've asked for a list of the names of all the queries that the API can understand and respond to. And as you can see, I got back a list of all these authorized queries with just a name and no other info. If I wanted a more detailed response, I could add some extra fields in my query right here. So that's how it works. Now, the question is, as an ethical hacker, is it worth the effort to learn GraphQL? Well, GraphQL is gaining traction. More and more companies are coming on board and are now using GraphQL. It's definitely not a tidal wave, but it's coming on gradually. And that's actually a bug bounty program that I'm hunting on, where a company is retiring its RESTful APIs at the end of this year, They've had a GraphQL API for a few years, and now they're switching to full GraphQL, and they're asking their customers to rewrite their own apps accordingly. So they're doing a total switch from RESTful to GraphQL. GraphQL also gives you a competitive edge. If you know how to hack GraphQL APIs, well, it opens up new territories for you where competition may not be as active as on mainstream web application hacking, for instance. If learning GraphQL may be a challenge for us as ethical hackers, you got to keep in mind it's also a challenge for developers. And that can lead to mistakes that will cause new vulnerabilities in their APIs, and that's new opportunities for us as well. Also, the GraphQL implementations that developers can use to design their APIs, they also have their own flaws that can sometimes be exploited. If you want to hack GraphQL APIs successfully, you will need to acquire some new skills. You'll need to understand some concepts like the GraphQL type system, the schema, introspection. You will also need to learn some new techniques and a brand new set of tools. Now that's the purpose of the videos that you'll find on my GraphQL playlist, so stick around and you should be good. Okay, so that's all from me for today. If you're interested, I have a post on my blog with a slightly more detailed overview of what we just covered here. You've got a link in the description below. In my next video, we'll look into the GraphQL type system and how we can use objects and fields. So until then, take care of yourself and stay safe out there.